Imagine a war where the soldiers do not carry guns, they carry suitcases. And inside those suitcases is not a bomb, but paper. Millions of sheets of paper that look exactly like money. This is the story of how the British government decided that the best way to defeat the French army was not to shoot them, but to bankrupt them. They built a secret factory in London that printed fake French currency night and day. It was the first time in history that a government weaponized inflation to destroy an enemy civilization. This is Tom from the Collapse Log, exploring the rise and fall of empires. Because behind every golden age lies a quiet decay no one sees until it is too late. When we look back at the great wars of the 18th and 19th centuries, we see the colorful uniforms, we see the lines of infantry marching through the smoke, we see the glint of the bayonets. We see Napoleon on his white horse pointing towards glory, but there was a shadow war happening at the same time, a war that was fought in the basements of banks and the back rooms of printing shops. To understand this war, we have to understand the desperate situation of the French Revolution in the 1790s. The king had been overthrown, the aristocracy had fled. The new revolutionary government in Paris was surrounded by enemies. Prussia, Austria, and Britain were all attacking the borders. France needed to raise an enormous army to defend itself. But there was a problem. The French treasury was empty. The tax system of the old monarchy had collapsed. The gold and silver had been smuggled out of the country by the fleeing nobles. So the revolutionaries came up with a radical solution. They seized the vast lands owned by the Catholic Church. They nationalized the estates of the church and the nobility. And then they issued a new paper currency called the assignat. The assignat was not like modern money. It was not backed by nothing. It was backed by the land. The idea was simple. If you held an assignat note worth 100 livres, it meant you owned a claim on 100 livres worth of land. You could use the money to buy a farm or a house from the state. It was a brilliant theoretical idea. It allowed the French government to print money to pay for the war, and the value of that money was secured by the most solid asset in the world, French soil. For the first few years it worked. The armies were equipped, the borders were defended, the revolution survived. But across the English Channel in London, there was a man watching this experiment with cold calculation. His name was William Pitt the Younger. He was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Pitt was a genius. He understood that war was not just about courage, it was about math. He looked at the French economy and he saw a vulnerability. The assignat relied entirely on trust. The French people had to believe that the paper in their pocket was actually worth something. They had to believe that the government would not print too much of it. Pitt realized that if he could destroy that trust, he could destroy the French government. He didn't need to defeat the French armies in the field. He just had to make the money they were paid with worthless. If the money was worthless, the soldiers would not fight, the farmers would not sell their grain, and the cities of France would starve. So in 1793, the British government authorized a secret operation that would change the history of warfare. They decided to become counterfeiters. This was not a small operation run by a few criminals in a basement. This was a state-sponsored industrial enterprise. The British government secured the services of French exiles. The nobles who had fled the guillotine were living in London, and they were desperate for revenge. They knew exactly what the assignats looked like. They knew the signatures. They knew the watermarks. The operation was centered at a paper mill in the district of Chelsea in London. Later, it expanded to 17 different paper mills across England. The British government provided the capital. They hired the best engravers in the world. They sourced the specific type of linen rag paper that the French used. They began to mass produce the assignat. The quality of the British forgeries was incredible. In fact, they were actually better than the real thing. The revolutionary government in Paris was printing money in a hurry using cheap ink and worn-out plates. The British forgeries were crisp, clean, and perfect. They focused on the high denomination notes, the ones that really mattered. But printing the money was only the first step. The real challenge was distribution. How do you get millions of fake francs from London into the pockets of the French people? The British Navy provided the solution. Every night, British frigates would sail close to the coast of Brittany and Normandy. These were areas where the population was still loyal to the king and hated the revolutionaries in Paris. Small boats would row out to the British ships. They would be loaded with heavy wooden crates. But these crates didn't contain muskets or gunpowder. They contained stacks of cash. The royalist rebels in the Vendée region became the distributors. They paid their soldiers with this fake British money. They bought food from local farmers with it. They bribed local officials with it. It spread like a virus. The farmers who sold their cows for this money didn't know it was fake. They took it to the market to buy tools. The tool merchant took it to the city to buy clothes. Within months, the fake money had infiltrated the entire French economy. It reached Paris. It reached the army camps on the Rhine. It reached the ports of the Mediterranean. The scale of the operation was staggering. Historians estimate that by 1795, there was more fake British printed money circulating in France than real money printed by the French government. Billions of fake francs were pumped into the system. Now think about the economic principles of supply and demand. The value of money is determined by its scarcity. If you double the amount of money in circulation, but you don't increase the amount of goods to buy, the prices will double. The British flooded France with so much paper that the currency began to hyperinflate. In Paris, the situation became apocalyptic. In 1790, nearly the assignat was trading at face value. By 1795, it was worth less than 1% of its face value. Imagine walking into a bakery. Yesterday, a loaf of bread cost 10 francs. Today, it costs 100 francs. Tomorrow, it might cost 1,000. The French government tried to fight back. They passed laws making it illegal to refuse paper money. They set price controls called the maximum. They threatened to guillotine anyone who rejected the assignat. But economic laws are stronger than political laws. The bakers simply stopped baking. Why would they trade their flour, which was real and valuable, for paper that was becoming worthless every hour? The farmers stopped bringing food to the cities. They hoarded their grain. Paris began to starve. The government couldn't pay its own civil servants. The judges stopped showing up to court. The police stopped patrolling the streets. The social contract was breaking down, and it was breaking down exactly as William Pitt had planned. Napoleon Bonaparte was a young general during this chaos. He was in Paris in 1795. He saw the bread riots. He saw the skeletons walking the streets. He saw his own soldiers selling their boots for a meal because their pay packets were just worthless paper scraps. This experience defined Napoleon's entire worldview on economics. He realized that a nation without sound money is a nation without a spine. He saw that the British weapon of forgery was more dangerous than the British fleet. When he finally seized power in 1799, his first priority wasn't to invade a neighbor, it was to kill the assignat. He publicly burned the printing plates of the old currency. He declared that the experiment was over. He returned France to a hard currency system based on gold and silver. He created the Bank of France to police the money supply. He created the franc germinal, which became the most stable currency in Europe. He did this because he knew that if he relied on paper, the British would just attack him again with their printing presses. He built a financial fortress that was impervious to forgery because you cannot forge gold. But the story doesn't end there. Napoleon was a quick learner. He saw how effective the British economic warfare had been, and he decided that two could play at that game. Years later, when he was emperor and fighting the Austrians in 1809, Napoleon set up his own secret forgery department in Paris. He ordered the creation of fake Austrian banknotes. When his army occupied Vienna, he set up a printing press in the Schönbrunn Palace itself. He printed millions of Austrian florins, and he used this fake money to pay for the supplies his army needed in Austria. He effectively forced the Austrian people to pay for their own occupation with counterfeit cash. He did the same thing to Russia in 1812. Before the invasion of Russia, Napoleon established a secret facility in Paris run by a man named Fane. They employed brilliant engravers to copy the Russian ruble note. When the Grand Army marched into Russia, they carried wagons loaded not with ammunition, but with fake rubles. Napoleon intended to use this money to buy food from the Russian peasants and to destroy the Russian economy, just as the British had destroyed the French economy 20 years earlier. But there was a flaw in Napoleon's plan. The British had succeeded because the French assignat was crude and easy to copy, and because the French internal security was weak. The Russian ruble was also easy to copy. In fact, the French forgeries were again too good. The Russian notes were printed on rough paper with messy ink. The French forgeries were printed on high-quality paper with perfect alignment. The Russian peasants were illiterate, but they weren't stupid. They looked at the money Napoleon's soldiers offered them. It looked too clean. It felt wrong. They realized it was fake. And even if they took it, the Russian policy of scorched earth meant there was nothing to buy anyway. So Napoleon's attempt at economic warfare failed. But it shows us that he understood the game. He knew that the war between Britain and France was not just a military conflict. It was a total war where every tool was legitimate. The British counterfeiting operation of the 1790s remains one of the most successful intelligence operations in history. It is rare that we can point to a specific covert action and say that it destroyed an economy. But in this case, we can. The British government effectively deleted the wealth of an entire generation of French citizens. They wiped out the savings of the middle class. They caused a famine that killed thousands. And they did it all from a polite building in London with the steady rhythm of a printing press. This story forces us to reconsider what we mean by war. We tend to think of war as a physical act, violent and loud. But the most devastating attacks are often silent. They attack the invisible systems that hold society together. Money is simply a system of trust. It is a shared belief that a piece of paper has value. The British realized that if you can break that trust, you don't need to break the walls of the city. The city will break itself. The hyperinflation of the assignat created the chaos that allowed a dictator like Napoleon to rise to power. The people were so desperate for stability, so desperate for bread, that they welcomed a strong man who promised to restore order. So, in a strange irony, by trying to destroy the French Revolution with fake money, Britain actually helped create the monster that would torment them for the next 15 years. They destroyed the Republic, but they birthed the empire. Napoleon never forgot the lesson. He carried a deep paranoia about paper money for the rest of his life. When he was in exile on St. Helena, he spoke about the British forgeries with a mix of anger and admiration. He called it a violation of the laws of honor. But Napoleon, of all people, knew that honor rarely survives contact with survival. Today, we live in a world where money is digital. We don't carry paper in suitcases anymore, but the vulnerability remains. We see nations engaging in cyber warfare attacking the banking systems of their enemies. We see sanctions that cut off countries from the global financial system. The tools have changed, but the logic is exactly the same as it was in 1793. If you can stop the money, you can stop the nation. The British Mint that printed the French money is a reminder that the line between a soldier and a criminal is often just a matter of who is giving the orders. To the French, the men who printed those notes were terrorists who starved children. To the British, they were patriots who were saving the monarchy. History is often written by the victors. And because Britain won, we rarely hear about this dark chapter. We hear about Trafalgar and Waterloo. We don't hear about the paper mill in Chelsea, but we should, because it teaches us that the economy is not separate from national security. It is the foundation of it. And it teaches us that the most dangerous weapon in an arsenal is not always the one that makes the biggest bang. Sometimes it is the one that makes the most noise in the marketplace. The collapse of the Assignats was a tragedy for millions of ordinary people. Families who had worked their whole lives saw their wealth evaporate in weeks. It is a reminder of how fragile our systems really are. We walk around with money in our pockets, assuming it will buy us food tomorrow. And we assume the system works. But all it takes is a loss of trust. All it takes is a flood of doubt. And suddenly the paper is just paper. Napoleon Bonaparte conquered Europe. He redrew the map. He changed the laws. But he never conquered the printing press. He spent his entire reign trying to outrun the ghost of the hyperinflation that Britain unleashed on his country. He filled his vaults with gold. He looted the capitals of Europe to find silver. He did everything he could to avoid relying on the one thing Britain could destroy: trust. And in the end, it was that rigidity, that inability to use modern credit that helped seal his fate. He was trapped by the memory of the fake money. So the next time you hold a banknote in your hand, look at it closely. Look at the watermark. Look at the complex designs. They are there for a reason. They are the armor plating of the economy. They are the defense against the silent war that never really ended. This is Tom from the Collapse Log. The battlefield is everywhere, and sometimes the enemy is already in your wallet.